Okay, welcome again to this webinar, Share Your Story with Maps. We're going to talk a lot about online mapping and how you can use information to tell stories online. So my name is Shane Bradt. I work at UNH Cooperative Extension, and I'm involved with eExtension Map Assist, which is a community of practice involved with geospatial technologies, and I'm part of this new mapping hub through eExtension, which many people will be hearing about more sometime in the next month. And this is a continuation of a series of webinars that I've been doing over the past few months, and really they're meant to be sequential. So going from the one in January to February, now this one and the one next week, looking about how you would use online maps to engage your audience, how do you use ArcGIS Online, which is one of the most compelling ways to create online maps, and also how do you share your stories with maps, which is the one that we're talking about today. Now we have another webinar on Monday, which is talking about how do you create a photo-based map, both using a smartphone and using online software as well, but talking a lot about how you use a smartphone. And the website below will lead you to the list of all 4 of those. Hopefully this is just the beginning of the webinars for this year on this topic, but these are the 4 we want to start with. And really the reason to talk about how you might want to use online maps or how you can tell your story with maps is that maps are a really compelling way to tell a story, but often when you are in person with somebody talking with a map, or telling a story or communicating with a map, you don't necessarily just put the map on the wall and stand there, but you're pointing out features, you're describing things, people are asking questions, maybe interacting in some ways with you as opposed to the physical map because they can't. But when you make an online map such as this, if you're a mapping person, you may be interested in knowing, well, what's on those points? And you might click on them. You might zoom around to see if there's somebody located near you. But a lot of people, when they get to online maps, they don't know what to do. They are not necessarily encouraged to engage with it, and it's hard sometimes for people to understand, well, what's the point of this map? How am I supposed to use this information? Am I supposed to look at this and say, wow, there's 3 people clustered together in New England? Or to say, wow, there's nobody on the West Coast? Or what is the point of this map? And so really, if you make an online map, that's great. The question is, how are you going to use that map to tell your story, to share information with people, and particularly since you're not going to be there if people are looking at an online map. And so that, to me, is one of the most exciting things about using ArcGIS Online, is this ability to create something called they call a story map. Now, I will say that there are other ways to create these so-called story maps, and the idea of the phrase story map is not unique to Esri, but they seem to be one of the companies and the products that are driving this idea the most. How do you take your map data, and sometimes as you see, it doesn't have to be map data necessarily, and tell your story. And the way that they've done this is through designing something called a story map. Now, if you look at the types of story maps that are out there, there's a variety, and they change all the time, mostly in a good way, because new ones evolve, they gain new functionality. But these are the 6 basic types that they have and that they describe on their webpage. We're just going to go through each one of them briefly and show a quick example of what each looks like. And then we're going to go and see each of them online interactively, just briefly to give you an idea of what are the types of ways that using this product you can present map data or other information, as you'll see, in a sort of storytelling approach. And the first one we're going to look at very basically, not surprisingly, something called the basic story map template. And this is something where you've created an online map using ArcGIS Online, and you'd like to take it and display it in such a way that nobody who's using it has to know anything about ArcGIS Online. They just have to go to this page, be able to use their mouse, maybe to zoom around and to look at things. Now, in some ways, this is not necessarily dramatically more compelling than just creating a simple map in Google Maps or even the initial map you create in ArcGIS Online, but in some other ways it is, because it interacts, the way you interact with the map is pretty smooth, and also, again, you don't have to know anything about the underlying mapping technology. You can just go to this page and look at it. And one quick example here that I found was this Sierra Leone cell phone tower range. And you'll notice at the top of each page there's a link that will bring you to this example online. And I'll also include these links in an email that goes around to everyone after the webinar is finished. And this is just simply a map showing where cell phone towers are located and showing buffers of 5, 10, 15, and 20-mile ranges in this area. So, not dramatic, but could be very useful for people who live there. It looks pretty slick, easy to understand, and visually pleasing. So this is any map that you have in ArcGIS Online. You can use a story map template to make a slicker, sort of easier to consume version of that map. Now, more interesting than that to me is being able to look at more than one map at a time or compare maps, because that's something if you make individual maps using ArcGIS Online or Google Maps or Mango Maps, how do you compare those maps? And there's two different ways that Esri has suggested that you use to compare two maps. What you'll see is that the next step, there's a series where you can compare many more than two maps. But these are two that are specific if you'd like to compare two maps, or you'd like to be able to look at a map missing only one of the layers that's in it. So there's one that's called Swipe, where you basically tell ArcGIS Online, here's two maps I'd like to compare, and it gives you this line that you can draw back and forth in the middle to reveal and hide a map. And also there's something called Spyglass, which works in pretty much the same way, except instead of swiping a line back and forth through the middle, you have a circle that you can drag around the map and let people see what the other map is behind. So briefly, here, this is one example, and this is obviously something this is used for a lot, comparing the way things were then and the way things are now. So this is in Tallahassee, Florida, looking at comparing aerial photos from 1954 and 2015. And obviously, there's quite a few differences that can be seen, but again, see that vertical line, and we'll see this in a moment interactively. You can swipe it back and forth to reveal differences in the map. Now notice in this map, they also added this address bar here so that you can search a place, presumably some place you know in town, and then be able to compare past and present. And this is an example of the Spyglass map where you have, on one hand, sort of the standard navigational nautical chart that NOAA provides, and on the other hand, you have some high-resolution digital terrain or bathymetry that you can then look at the actual bottom by moving that spyglass around. So again, if you have two maps that you'd like to compare, these are both ways that you can do that. Now, what if you have more than two maps and you want to show a whole series of different maps? Then they have something called a map series. Now, there's 3 different versions of the map series, and I have examples that show all 3, but the idea is if you have a series of maps, or in some ways a series of points that you'd like to make, you can use this approach to story maps. So here's an example of one using that tabbed look, where it's looking at differences in characteristics of Cuban trade. And of course, you see this first page, it's not a map, it's just an image. And you might say, well, wait, this is a story map, where is the map? Well, trust me, there are maps that you can use in story maps, but you don't necessarily have to use a map on every tab if part of your story that you'd like to tell is that you'd like to show, who knows, cars in a historic street in Cuba somewhere, then that's what you show. That's perfectly fine. The cool thing about this template is that it's easy to use. You can create pretty slick looking websites, and of course, as many maps as you want to use, you can use, and all you have to do is create them in ArcGIS Online and point to them using this story map template. Another example is having information on the sides instead of having tabs at the top. You have information at the side that you can click from 1 to 2 to 3, and as you click on each of those major headings, the information below changes, and also the map on the right changes. And here's an example looking at differences in the shale gas boom in the United States. And another approach, and this is was a problem, and now they've remedied it in some way, is what if you wanted to show more than, let's say, 6 or 7 tabs? It was really difficult using the tab format. Now they've made it so that you can have each map or each slide have just a little round circle so that you can fit many, many more of those. And as you click on each of those, the information here on the side changes, and also the map or the image or whatever you've displayed there changes. So there's a different way, and this is one of the first ways to use story maps, so it's, in a way it's very separate from these others, which is, what if you have a bunch of pictures that you'd like to show that were taken in different locations? And this is something we'll be talking a lot about on Monday, with how to use your phone to create story maps. And this is something called a map tour. So here's an example of Delaware State University, where they have their campus tour virtual, where they've had a whole bunch of images that were taken around campus. You can click on each image on the map here on the left, and it will move to that image. And you can click on the images down below, and it will scroll you through. Change this to represent what that image is. You can have text here, and it will move that map below to that location on campus. So this is one approach, again, to sort of leading people through a story or having them experience a location. And a more advanced version, and probably to me in some ways the most advanced versions of story maps, are how do you use story maps to really have and control completely a narrative, because all of these allow you to control what it is that people are seeing and present it in a much better way than just having one, sending people a link to a whole bunch of different online maps. But using the map journal, it's as if you're creating a book that has a series of pages, and as people advance from page to page by clicking on this or clicking down, the page turns and there's information. And you can have whatever you'd like here, and on this side, again, you can have whatever you like. It could be an image, for example, this, or it could be a map. And this is a way to really almost have a storybook that people can turn through, some of which have maps displayed in interactive maps. Now, in addition to these, and most of these, you can create a great deal of it just using the built-in templates. Don't have to know anything necessarily about coding. You do have to know how to use ArcGIS Online, and any maps that you would like to show up, interactive maps, you'll have had to create either ahead of time or while you're building the template. You'll have to create those maps themselves in ArcGIS Online. So the great thing is, if you're not somebody who knows coding, that's fine. You can still have and use these maps. Then again, if you do know coding, or you know someone who does, and you're willing to hack around a bit, of course, there's, as everything nowadays, there's so much more that you can do. And here's just a couple examples of custom maps. Here's one that has been circulated around and is featured on Esri's website. It's a whole new template that they're actually going to release. They created it now first as a custom map, and sometime later this year we'll release this new template that lets you have sort of these full page, full versions of images and maps. And it's better to see this in interactive than try to explain it. And then another type of custom map was this one, which was fairly simple, but once you'll see it in action, you can see it's fairly interactive, that allows you to control what data are displayed here by clicking on these different areas. So it shows the living wage based on different types of families. And when you click on the different type of family, these images here, the imagery moves around up and down, and the map over here updates. You can also change from looking at counties to cities. So, do you know coding? Are you willing to do coding? Do you know anybody who does coding? If the answer is yes, then of course you can go wild. So some of these things are a little more advanced than beginners or intermediate folks can do, but as I said, the templates are so good that there's a lot that you can do just knowing ArcGIS Online and knowing a little bit about story maps. So what I'm going to do briefly is just go and look at those all just for a few minutes online so you can see what they look like in sort of in real action. But does anybody have any questions before I move to that point? Okay, well, if you do have questions, again, please put it in the questions or go ahead and put it in the chat. So this is the first example I used using the basic map. You can see that this is those cell phone tower ranges. There's a little legend here that you can unfurl, and it shows you the distance. And as you see, you can zoom in zoom around to the different areas, and go ahead and click on the cell phone tower, and it gives you the information for that tower. So not extremely advanced, but again, something that is difficult to do with other platforms, which is take a map, create it, and then have a version that you can give to people, full page, that works pretty in a pretty interactive fashion with them not having to log in or know anything. Now this is the example of that first comparison of two maps approach, which is the swipe map. You can imagine a football stadium area. The difference between 1954 and 2015 might be pretty dramatic, but this shows that swiping where you can reveal and hide differences in the map. And again, it can be two different maps that you're showing, or you can be revealing and hiding one layer on a map as well. And of course, as you zoom around to different areas, the maps update and you can swipe in those areas as well. Another version of that, as we said, was the spyglass, and you can see this pretty much the same effect, but you're looking at just a specific section of it. I love the fact that it's being used in nautical maps. The spyglass is great, and as you zoom in and out and move around the map, the scale changes and the data change underneath. Now, as the first example of this sort of series of maps, and again, this first slide, quote unquote, or tab is not a map at all, you can see that as you click on these different tabs, it reveals both information here, it can be graphics or images here, and this happens to be an interactive map that has information showing routes of trade, and each one of these can have different information, different interactive maps that you've built using ArcGIS Online. Again, this is another type of application where instead of having it in tabs, it has it here at the side, and you can see when you click on these, they open up, information down here is displayed, and whatever interactive map is relevant to that, you can see here, and you can also see that there's a legend. So part of how you choose this can be by personal taste, and part of it may be based on the data that you have to display. And again, having the ability to have these buttons up here allows you to fit many, many more tabs than you could in either of those other formats. So that might be a determining decision into what it is that which one of these options you're going to choose. So here again is that example of map tour. We'll talk a lot more about this on Monday, where you can either click here on the points of the map, click down below on the pictures, and of course this map underneath is interactive, and you can go around and look at the different, whatever layers they've chosen to show, and also find the different points of imagery and click on them on the map and have them displayed here. And the journal format seems to be in some ways one of the most compelling as far as narrative and storytelling. You can see that you can either click this down button or each of these items. You can also see they have names where you can scroll down and look at different features. So here's the route that they took, for example. Here is the area of Elephant Island. Even though this is not a quote-unquote map, this is actually an image. It's not an interactive map. But you can still have a variety of images and interactive maps shown throughout. This, again, is one of the new templates they'll be coming out with soon. Currently, it's a custom map, and more websites are designed like this. But you can see you can either advance through it using information up here, or you can just simply scroll down the map, or the story map, to have information revealed. You can also see it has pretty slick effects where every time I scroll down, new information can come up or new data can be displayed. They actually don't have a lot of interactive maps in this example, but you could house interactive maps in here as well. And then a custom version of a more, in some ways, more standard map shows this living wage map where you can look at either counties or cities. And when you click on what the data show for a parent or spouse of two children, As you drag this around the map, the information on the left here updates, but if you'd like to look single parent with one child, you can click and it moves that information up here and redisplays the data, or single adult, moves it up there and displays the data. So again, this is a more advanced map that would take some coding. Not going to do this in a template per se, but showing it just as an example of the way that things can work in story maps. So that's the broad tour of the idea behind story maps, what they do, how they work, different examples of what you may be interested in doing. If you go to Esri's website for story maps, they have tons and tons of examples in that gallery of maps that people have created and shared. So any questions before we go any further? The next little section here, I'm just going to show you the basics of how to create a few story maps using some of the basic templates. Okay. Well, there's two different ways to work with story map templates. To me, the most compelling right now, especially for beginners, is a thing called My Stories. So if you go to the Story Map website and you look up on top, there's something called My Stories. So if you click on it, it brings you to this whole different interface which didn't exist before, which actually makes creating story maps quite a bit simpler for people who don't have a lot of experience in ArcGIS Online. Keep in mind, if you are going to use maps in your story maps, sounds strange to say, but if you are going to use maps in your story maps, you still will have to build them in ArcGIS Online. But this is a different way of looking at your stories and creating story maps. Now, one of the things that's interesting, which changed, I think, yesterday or the day before, is that they're being very upfront here about how you create a free non-commercial public account, which in the past it was a little bit more hidden and not as obvious. And if you have an organizational account, or you want to get an organizational account, and that's something that you pay for over time, you can get a free 60-day trial to try that out. I suggest everyone just get a public account just to try things out, even if you have or are going to get an organizational account. That's a little bit new the way they're displaying it, but this is really new. Turns out, in order to create story maps and even to use ArcGIS Online, you don't need to have an ArcGIS Online account through Esri. You can use either Facebook or Google Plus credentials to log in and get a story map account and get an ArcGIS Online public account through Esri. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing in people's mind to pair their accounts, but this is brand new. I've only heard about it in the past few days. I think it might be less than a week old that you can use those credentials to go ahead and get an account which will let you start making maps. So once you sign in, you'll see this interactively in a moment. You'll have your My Stories. You click on Create My Story, and then you're presented there with those templates. Now, part of what we don't talk about in this webinar, and maybe we will in future, is, well, how do you pick what works for you? Why a map tour? Why a journal? Why a map series? What story are you trying to tell? And that is not something we can cover in this webinar specifically, but it is a good thing to think about and to have conversations about. One of the other interesting things is you can click on this Ask a Pro side, and it'll lead you through this idea of trying to help you to decide what it is that you need or which template might fit your needs. So if you're not sure what you need, that could help. So it's interesting because even though this exists, it turns out, I even tried this today and I was unable to create a basic map through this My Stories. You have to do it through the standard ArcGIS Online interface, which I find a bit surprising, but that's what it is. It says it's coming in the future, so I don't know when that is. It could show up any day. But what we're going to do is I'm going to show you quick examples of how you use two maps you've already created to create a map series, and also how to use a swipe and a spyglass if you already have two maps that you'd like to use. Now, keep in mind, if you're used to ArcGIS Online, and if you've listened to the past webinars, if you're already in ArcGIS Online, you'd have to sort of back out of it to get to stories. So just briefly, if you're there and you're at a map in ArcGIS Online that you'd like to create a story map of, how you do that is click on this Share button up here, and it'll open up this dialog box, the Share dialog box. And down here you have Create a Web App, which will open up a gallery that shows all of the different types of apps that you can create. If you click on this Build a Story Map, you'll get to a similar screen where you can choose the different templates. Not exactly the same, it works slightly differently, but it's very, very similar to going through my stories. You just have to get to this point to get to those templates. Let's go ahead and build a couple of story maps. So here I've logged into an ArcGIS Online account that I have, and I'm going to create 2 different story maps. Now again, I've already created these maps in ArcGIS Online, so they're inside of my account. I believe I went through the process of building those maps in a previous webinar, although that may not be the case. But to create a story, I'm going to go ahead and click this Create My First Story. After you've created your first story, you can click up here on Create Story. So you see this selection that we have, your choice. So I'm going to go ahead at first and create a map series, even though I only have 2 maps. And guess sorry about that. You can see right up here, the first choice that you're given. Do you want it tabbed? Do you want it bulleted? How do you want it? And just for the heck of it, I'll choose bulleted down here. It's also nice that in these, they have lots of links, view a live example. So if you're not sure what one looks like, you can go ahead and click on that button, and it'll show you an example of it. The first thing it asks is, what do you want to call it? So I'm going to call mine Great Bay Eelgrass Distribution Over Time. And click Go Ahead. And it's going to have me build the first bullet. So what is that bullet title? What is it? What do I want it to say when people float over it? First thing I want it to say in the first bullet is Eelgrass Distribution in 2001. And that's a map that I created in ArcGIS Online. So I'm going to go down here to select a map. Now notice, if you haven't yet created a map, you can go ahead and click Create Map at this point. So I'm going to pick my Eelgrass in 2001 map. You see that you can have a bunch of different configuration here, location, content, if you want pop-ups, if you want a legend. But for this case, I'm just going to go ahead and click on Add. And now I have my Great Bay Eelgrass Distribution Over Time map. The first tab is this distribution in 2001. I'm going to just put this in here briefly. You can see that you can have rich text. You can add a lot of different things here. For brevity's sake, going to put one piece of text. Oops. Let's see. Actually, I think I want. No, that's fine. I'll do that. And then I go, since I'm done with that, and I'll click on Add, which will give me the ability to put another bullet in there. And this is my second bullet, and I'm going to add another map, the Eelgrass Distribution from 2011. Again, I'm not going to change any of these, but notice that it's going to keep those maps in sync. So when I click from tab to tab or button to button, they're going to line up. You can click on Add. I'm going to go ahead and put some quick text in here. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a picture of eelgrass here. So call this Eelgrass in Great Bay for a picture. And I'm going to add an image. Now you can see you can tie it to Flickr, Facebook, Picasa, although I've heard that there's some changes going on in Picasa. It will be interesting to see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and use a URL that I already have here and add that. You can also see there are options for how that image is displayed. I'm going to click Add. And for the text of that, I'm going to copy and paste. Oops, the text I wanted isn't there. That's fine. I'll just say picture of Great Bay with eelgrass. Okay, and highlight this as well, and go ahead and put that up. Now, I actually want this in front, so I'm going to click on Organize, and it allows me to drag that to the front. So now I've reordered the tabs, and I'm going to go ahead and save my story. Now, this is important, the way that things are controlled in ArcGIS Online. In order for other people to see it, you have to make things public. But this is the most obvious that I've ever seen them make it, which is great. You can see you can copy and paste this. You can Facebook it, tweet it, embed it in a web page, whatever you'd like. And I'm just going to go ahead and see what it looks like. Oops. Oh, up here. You can also click View Story. So here's the finished version. Again, this is something I could send people directly to. The first thing it shows is a picture of Great Bay. As I click on tab 2, we have our interactive map here of the Great Bay with the eelgrass distribution in 2001. And when I click on the third tab, it has eelgrass distribution data from 2011. So you can see this didn't require any coding. It required some work ahead of time to understand what you wanted in the map and also to have this text ready. But building the actual web map was fairly straightforward and required no coding at all. So once I go back here to my gallery, you'll see that this shows up. I've already created here. We have the story. If you want this to be more than just a city, you can click on Upload Thumbnail. If you have an image that's used in your map, you can use that. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that image to be my thumbnail. And it also does this little check to see if it can find issue, to see if things are public or not. If you want to edit the map that it was created from, you can do that right here. You know, you can view the story, tweet it, get a link to it. This is this nice new way to interact with and manage your stories or story maps. And the second story map, I'm going to create just one more here. When I click on Create Story, this time I'm going to choose a swipe to compare those two maps. And you'll see that it's fairly similar, where it's going to ask you, okay, what are the maps you'd like to use? And in this case, I'm going to use that eelgrass 2001. You can see that it takes this code, it grabs it automatically, which is good, because sometimes in the past you had to search for that code for yourself. And as you see, you have the option to select the layer you want swiped, which is not what I want to do. Instead, I'm going to compare it to a completely different map. And if you click on this little search dialog box, again, it comes up to show you the maps that you have access to in your account. And I chose that map from 2011. This gives you the ability here to set some basic parameters, like, do you want a description with information here? Do you want a legend, a pop-up? There's another new thing called the swipe series, which lets you have a whole bunch of different locations within your map that you can pop back and forth between, which is very slick. And just learned about it today, so I'm not going to show you that. But I'm going to turn off the description and the pop-up and just have the legend here and click on Open the App. So what you see is that it has created this map. It has a little legend that you can fold up and down. As you zoom in and out of the map, both maps update the same. And across the middle here, you have this slider that you can use to show and hide the data or swap back and forth between maps. I'm going to quickly change some of the text here to be a little better. And the other thing which I forgot on the previous map is that there's also, in addition to what you've set in this initial dialog, you have these settings here. And if you click on settings, it opens up this dialog again that you can go ahead and change things if you'd like. But in this dialog, you have a few more options, like choosing the theme, if you have a header, what it says, if you want your own logo, if you want Esri's logo. I'm going to change this text to be more specific to mine. And also the extent, which is set by default, but if you'd like the map to be zoomed in or out farther when it first loads, you can set that here. So now that I have that, I can click on Save and then Share. And again, it's going to ask me, you really need to share it publicly in order to see it. And here is that version of the map that I could send to people to look at. So again, once you have the data in place, creating that story map swipe is pretty straightforward. Of course, the other thing you can do is if instead of the swipe you wanted the spyglass, you can just go up here to Settings, and choose, instead of the vertical bar, the spyglass layout and click apply. When you go back here, you have to save it. And somewhat bizarrely, to me at least, you have to reload the page. So I'm going to go ahead and reload the page. And what you'll see is that now once it reloads, this is the spyglass version of that map. You see the spyglass here showing the data underneath. And again, if you share, you now see that you have a new version of the map that has now the spyglass as an option as opposed to the swipe tool. And if we go back to that main page, you'll see that sometimes it doesn't automatically add the map, but it says, looks like you've created a new story. Refresh your story, and it'll go ahead and add that in. Now, you can see this default icon is a rocket ship. I don't want a rocket ship, but I don't have a thumbnail. There's no image in my map, so I can just go ahead and upload an image. So what I did is take a screenshot of that map earlier, and you can even zoom in and out to different extents if you want, but go ahead, click save, and so now that's going to be my new thumbnail. And another little tool that's nice is you can click collapse here, and it folds all of the information up so you can see your list pretty cleanly of all your story maps. And to interact with each of these, you can go ahead and click on them, and it will fold them open so you can access those features. Okay, so I'm going to show you for this demo. Does anybody have any questions on any of this before I leave and go back for the final little bit here of time? Kelsey, can you combine story maps? For example, using a swipe map in a map series. Yes, I've never seen a swipe map in a map series, but I have. Yes, you can do that definitely. I know I've seen it in different versions, but yes, you can combine story maps. So there's actually a map that I used to show people that a graduate student created, and it was a map series, and it had a swipe map within it. So yes, you can combine them. Another thing to mention, of course, that sometimes gets overlooked is that you can send information to people, but you can, by using this link, but you can also embed. So you can choose different options if you want it medium, small, your own width, and it gives you the code that lets you embed that in another web page. So if you had a web page or a blog that you wanted to embed it in, you could go ahead and do that as well. All right, any other quick questions? All right. And then, oops, move back. So again, the point of this was supposed to be to give you an idea of how you could use story maps, specifically ArcGIS Online and Esri Story Maps, to try to take your map data or other information you want and create a compelling, interactive online way to tell your story, to communicate your points, to share map data, and to hopefully engage people a lot more than a static online map would be, or even a typical interactive online map that's more vanilla. Of course, the other thing you can see is that these are so powerful that you can really use them to communicate any story, even if it has nothing whatsoever to do with the map. So if you don't have GIS data and you don't have any maps in ArcGIS Online, there are plenty of ways you can still use these story map templates to make web pages and to share information with people. The next webinar up is on Monday, March 7th. And we're going to very specifically focus on how do you use that geotagging map? How do you take a lot of different photos that you've collected, both how do you do it on your phone and also how do you do it online to take that information and make one of those map tours. So that's coming up on March 7th. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me directly. If you have any suggestions for different things we should do webinars about, I'd be definitely interested in hearing what you have to say. To me, this was just the beginning of the series to get people interested and also to have some way that if people ask me questions, well, how do you use ArcGIS Online? How do you use Story Maps? That we have this documented, but I think this is just the beginning. There's so much more that we could do. We could go into more detail about how different maps are used, or even examples of how people have used different maps in their work. So I'm very interested in hearing what people have to say. And if you do make any maps, feel free to share them with me. I'd love to see what you've done with them. This will be the last moment here that I'll have if people have any questions that they would like to ask before we sign off. And keep in mind again that this recording will be available probably by tomorrow, and it will be posted on the learn.extension.org page where the webinar was listed, but also will be sent, information about that will be sent by email to all of you. Okay. Well, great. If there are no more questions, thank you everybody for joining, and again, look for the recording to be posted.